Shall we make a start? I've got a handout, and I think I'd like to just do this as a more sort of discursive session, really, because I think there's a lot of anxiety and quite a lot of myths around academic writing, and I think quite often they're sort of perpetuated by the kind of, it's almost like the junior doctor thing. It's like, we've done it, so it's got to be equally as stressful and terrifying for everybody else. And actually, I think academic writing's quite enjoyable. You know, it's a creative process, and it's where you get to consolidate your ideas and your thinking, and to demonstrate, you know, how original your ideas are, or how good your research is. And all the assessment methods and the CV talk and everything is important, but at the heart of it is, if you do good quality research and you write it up well, all of that other stuff will just fall into place. You know, it just happen because you're good at your job. And so I think what I wanted to do was focus right down to actually, having done a lot of reviewing and that sort of thing, what have I noticed about what a really good four-star paper is. And I've put 4-star because I think we should be aiming for 4-star from the beginning. I think a lot of people, the best work they do comes out of their doctorates. You know, if you spent 3 years on your own piece of research, you should be able to write something up that in your field is world class. You know, you should be able to, and you see it quite often that the best papers in our ref submission, for example, some of our best ref papers have come from people who are 2 or 3 years postdoc, but still thinking and writing very much in that field and consolidating their work. So I'll just say a bit about where I've come from and the sort of papers that I'm familiar with, because I think that might help as well. So my field is really sort of urban studies, and by training I've come from urban theory, so first degree in urban studies, and then professional qualifications in planning and urban design, and then a PhD in a Department of Architecture, but it was very much about policy and that sort of thing. And I lead a research centre now in the Faculty of Environment and Technology, as a research centre that looks at issues around contemporary urbanism, really, from design to policy. So we have people who focus on sort of sociological issues, design issues, to some quite technical ends of things, you know, modelling and that sort of thing. So the range of papers we produce and we look at span those different types. Some are opinion pieces, think pieces, some are, you know, straight presentations of data, project work. We get our funding from the European Commission, from EPSRC, from AHRC, so we span quite a range of different types of outputs. I've also just finished our ref submissions, so reviewed, I think, I don't know, 300-400 outputs to get down to the ones that we need. And I'm on the ref sub-panel for my unit of assessment, so I will, in the new year, start actually reviewing all of the ref papers from all over the country. So we've, as a panel, started to look at, obviously, how do we assess papers? You know, what as a panel, what as a ref panel are we looking for? And one of the important things, I think, is to, again, demystify this kind of idea that everybody out there on a ref panel or on a editorial board is out to get you and criticise your work. Actually, most referees are looking for the best in, you know, they want to see good work, and they want the best out of an author. And usually it's a case of you're a bit disappointed. You think, oh, this paper could have been so much better if it just did X or Y, or explained this a bit more clearly, or whatever. So what I've done is top 10 tips from doing this kind of reviewing and having training in reviewing, and I'm on the editorial. I've refereed papers for, I think, about 30 different journals now in the field of urban studies and whatever. And you get guidance from those as well. So from doing all of that work, I've kind of put together a top 10 tips. And this isn't tips on, this is tips on writing 4-star papers, but also on having your papers assessed as 4-star papers. And I think that's quite an important distinction, because you have to be clear and you have to tell the reader why your paper is a 4-star paper or a 3-star paper. You don't be modest and let them work it out for themselves. So what I thought I'd do is, there's sort of sections in this paper. So there's point 1 is one thing. Then I'm going to take 2 to 5 together, 6 to 8 together, and 9 to 10. And what I thought I'd do is have a quick break in between and any questions, discussions. Otherwise, I'm just going to be talking for ages. So will that work, do you think? Okay. So the first thing, and this dawned on me quite late, and Glenn and I were talking about this when we started doing the ref review. The first thing to be really clear about is the type of paper that you're writing, okay? Because there are really different types of academic paper, particularly in social sciences, design, arts fields, but also in the pure sciences. That, is your paper a review paper? Is it a presentation of new empirical work data? Is it a synthesis of existing research out there, which is different to a straight review? Is it an opinion piece, a think piece, a provocative piece where you're trying, so there's different types of paper. And what you really need to do is understand what's best in show in each of those different types, and really be conscious of what sort of paper it is you're writing, and not have your papers sort of in between, a bit of think, a bit of, and we did an exercise in my research centre. We had an away day, and everyone was saying, I don't know, a 2-star, a 3-star, and we reviewed blind 12 papers, and we, all the researchers looked at them, and we scored them, and we blind put our tallies up, and we all, bar none, agreed on the top. We put them in order, and we were pretty much there. So people always say, I don't know the difference, but actually you do know it when you see it. If you see a really good review paper, it sets out what the purpose of the paper is. It explains the scope of the review. It does a really, really thorough review. It reflects on the importance of the findings. It pulls out, the differences in the debates. It concludes with those. There's a weight to it and a quality that when you see it. And I think with a lot of these things, if you think about, we've all read loads and loads of papers in our research. So if you think about the papers you go back to time and time again, the papers that stand out in these different types in your field, and you think, hang on, that is why that was a really good synthesis paper, and that's why that paper, it didn't only present data, it kind of, So does that sort of make sense? Do you kind of, and I think it is useful to even just go back through your own literature and have a look at the ones that really worked, So are there any questions about that? Any sort of, some people make their whole careers on writing review papers. People have different profiles.
I was going to just reflect on something that I've watched about people who are learning the craft of academic writing.
Yeah.
And how that looking at those really good examples of papers, people forget that there was a first draft of that paper at some point.
Yeah.
And they get a bit scared by, oh my God, I'm never going to be able to write like that. But actually, it's probably much more useful to see or to recognise that there was a really rough copy of that to start with, that over time was drafted and edited to produce that final product. So, yes, it's good to aim for it, but you need to understand that you shouldn't be put off by those polished papers, I think.
Yeah, and sometimes it takes years to develop that. Other people can do it straight away. They've got it, and it's quite a hard thing to teach in a way, because a lot of it is about how clear you are explaining things, and that goes, in all different sorts of papers. But you can get a 4-star paper out of a review. Some ref panels specifically say they won't take reviews, others do. So in the social sciences, you can get a 4-star review paper, but it has to be a really, really, it has to have a purpose. So I'll come on to that. Okay, so I'll take points 2 to 5 and then I'll stop. So I think what's really important is that every paper you write is a kind of mini project with its own questions, its own findings, conclusions or whatever, but every paper's got its own purpose, and even if it's part of a much bigger project, you have to kind of sell it as its own entity, and that I find that very useful because it gives me a bit of a refreshing impetus when I start to write it. Because if you've been working on something for ages, and then you've got the paper, the 4 papers to do from the project, But actually, if you think of each one as a project in its own right and its own little artifact, it freshens up your approach to writing it. But you have to have good material to write up. There's no doubt about it. You can't get a good paper out of average research. But you are in control of how you frame the material that you've got. So you can have, the same data set could be written up from so many different angles with so many different questions, for example. So treat it like a mini project. You don't have to condense or summarise a whole research project into one paper. If some of the good scientific papers, as we were hearing this morning, really are, go for quality, not quantity. But you don't, if you're working on a big project, the aims of your paper don't have to be the same aims as the project aims. You see that so many times, and then it doesn't work because you're only presenting a section of the material or something. So you can make a really good paper by being in control of your own aims. And sometimes I find the focus of papers is quite different at the end of a project to what you would have thought it would be at the beginning of a project. So something might have happened in policy or something globally out there which gives your research a new contemporary twist, and you can frame your findings or your material with a new question or a new focus, and that tends to sort of refresh and make a good paper. So I think that treating each paper as as a kind of not just one in a sequence of things that sections up a project is very important. I think it's really important to structure the paper simply and logically and explain the structure to the reader at the beginning. And I can't stress this enough, and this goes for writing research bids as well. Actually writing anything persuasive, which is a lot of what we're doing all the time in academia, writing things to persuade people, is that a lot of the response to your writing, particularly research bids, but papers too, is an emotional response, and we all have it. So if we're getting bored by a paper or frustrated because you don't know why you're being told this material, or you're lost in an overcomplicated heading structure, and even if it's really good, somebody's not going to give you the 3-star or the 4-star because you've made it too hard for them to understand what you're trying to say. So when you're critically reviewing papers, or when you're reading papers for your own research, notice how the ones that spell it out for you are the ones that you'll go back to. And that doesn't mean it's dumbing down or anything like that. It's just really good practice that you position your paper squarely in the context of your subject. You have a really good beginning to the paper. And loads of papers don't do this. They assume that you're kind of working on the same project with them or something, any reader, and they kind of bang into the detail. You're like, I have no idea where this research is situated, So if you get a good start to the paper, situate it in a broader context, I always really set out the structure of the paper at the beginning of the paper, and say why I'm telling you this. Why do you need to know this? Why is it important? So don't just go, I'm going to start with context and then have a heading context. You say, I'm going to start, I'm going to set out the concept of the way that this policy developed, for example, because it has implications for how it might be interpreted in the future in the EU. Or so, it's that kind of, you need to spell it out why it's important and explain that structure. And you really, you need to make sure and work really hard, draft after draft, on the argument and get the argument flowing. The paper should flow from section to section. Always go back and recheck how one section ends and the next section starts, so that it's flows from one to another, and you haven't suddenly gone from, you know, context to method, and there's no kind of link between them. So always guide your reader through. It's kind of polite, I think, and particularly in research bids. You know, that's a persuasive document to get money. You know, if you've frustrated or annoyed the reader, they're not going to give you the money. Just as simple as that. And, you know, so this kind of taking people through way is very important, I think. Number 4, really important point, I think, is always at the end of your writing, is to revisit the conclusions. I think so many times people run out of steam at the conclusions and they do a few lines, and we've all done it, and they're so disappointing to the given the material, because either they don't go back to the big picture, or they pull out some small points, but even as a reader you think, oh, there's more to this than meets the eye, you know. So really, really spend time on your conclusions, and sometimes the conclusions have changed. You know, as you write through the paper, you get to conclusions and you think, actually, that emphasis ought to now be at the front of the paper as well. So always do that job, and sometimes leave a day or two if you can between, you know, don't finish the conclusion of the abstract and send it off. You know, if you can have the luxury of a few days, look at the conclusions. I mean, I've got a really good example of this. She won't mind me using it, I'm sure. One of our team, Katie McClymont, who did a lot of research. She got a Spur grant to do research on cemeteries, and she did a lot of interviews with cemetery managers, and it was about how cemeteries are planned for in the planning system in the UK, and how, you know, provision of cemeteries. And she wrote a very, very good, tight paper writing up her research. And when she got to the conclusion, she said something, I think it was one line about, but really, you know, this brings into question, the way cemeteries are dealt with, brings into question the kind of secular nature of cities, and that there's no space for considering the spirituality of space anymore. Everything's very functional, you know, in planning. It's, you know, there's no kind of spiritual, it doesn't have to be religious, but there's no kind of spiritual and a couple of us in the team were reviewing that paper, and we had a kind of a meeting. We sort of said, we all found that the most important line in that whole research was that one, you know, that one line. And we said, you know, you can publish this and it will be a 2-star paper on cemeteries, which only people who Google cemeteries and planning will find. But as she'd been doing a lot more research, she actually had developed some really sophisticated ideas and some really good thinking on the post-secular city and the relationship between land use and spirituality, and, you know, all these sorts of much, much bigger questions, which she had actually spoken about in a different context at another conference. And so we said, really, the best thing to actually, that's, you know, if you're going to get cited and you're going to make a contribution and make a name for yourself, you know, is it worth publishing all that really good empirical material on cemeteries, or is your paper really about this issue around spirituality in the city with a really good example worked through by looking at cemeteries, you know? And that would probably take another month's work in between all the other jobs she had to do, but that was worth doing, because that paper will probably be a 4-star paper, actually. She's, you know, and the other one would probably have been a 2, because it was a flat presentation. And so I think that's always worth doing. You get to the end of it and you think, actually, have I said the big thing I wanted to say? What's the framing of this material? And often it's the things you might discuss with your, you know, colleagues over coffee that about your work, or at a conference or something, that really ought to be what you're saying in your papers, not, you know, not just some new data or some, you know, these kind of big things. So that's revisit. And then the other point is, don't underestimate the importance of a good abstract. And I've only learnt this really in the last 18 months, I think. Again, we often rush the abstract and send it on, you know, quickly. It's the thing you do last with the keywords or whatever. It's really, really important. Now everybody searches for your papers on databases that only show the abstracts often. And in the ref process for sure. You know, I think, you know, as panel members we'll have thousands of papers to read and not much time to do it. You need, that abstract will tell you, if it can tell you everything you need to know about the paper, the key findings, you know, I've put in here what you really need to do. It should have the context, the research problem, the approach, the key findings, and why your paper is important. That's absolutely critical. Tell the reader, this is the first cross-sectional survey of blah, 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 done in the UK and the US, or this is the largest post-occupancy survey in Europe, or, you know, or whatever. Or if it's not, you know, don't overclaim and don't say silly things, but point out why it's important. You know, is it challenging a debate? Is it that sort of thing? And that has to be in the abstract. So don't leave that to a few lines at the bottom of the conclusion as well. So those are things about kind of the content and the structure of the paper, I think. Do you want to? I'll stop now. Are there any sort of questions or comments about that? I think? Yeah.
Just to say that was really, really useful, thinking about broader concepts and that twisting, that's not quite the right word, but the reframing and using those sort of bigger ideas rather than being too focused on what the data is about in a way is a really useful tool for and a good example there. For me, though, the writing of the abstract is always the challenging bit, and I just wondered if you had any sort of broader comments about writing abstracts. Obviously,
I hate it. I hate writing the abstract. I hate doing the keywords. I hate doing the abstract. It's better to leave a bit of time and come back to it and go through your paper with a highlighter pen, and you know, there's always the key sentences that say the key things, and it's good for doing the conclusions as well. And you know, you know, you tend to write papers as you do the research process. So you sort of start at the beginning, method, but really you want the key messages to foreground in the abstract. So it's almost inverted. So most abstracts still summarise the paper in the same structure as the paper, which isn't a good thing to do, because what you want to do really is put the findings first, because they can, you know, I mean, you say something about your approach, but you don't need, you know, so many people take the whole of an abstract to say it was a survey of 500 people who lived in Melbourne and blah blah blah, and don't tell you what they found, you know. So highlight what you actually found, what the contribution to knowledge is, the significance, the reach. Put that in the abstract, and if you've got space, then say a bit more about the methods. But I don't think anybody enjoys writing abstracts, really.
I actually find it easier to not go back to the paper,
to walk
away and actually think about, okay, someone knows nothing about my paper, and they're going to have 10 lines or whatever it is to read. What's important for them to take away from that? Because I find if I go back to my paper, I'm pulling out key sentences and trying to juggle it all together, and it isn't actually getting across a particularly effective summary of what I'm saying.
Yeah, that.
I often use different words. I often find my abstract becomes more creative and actually is gone to a slightly deeper level, perhaps, because it's not just there was a mixed approach and then this was that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, or sometimes, I mean, we've sort of we had a writing group going when we had more sort of early career researchers in my centre, and they almost used to kind of try to do each other's, you know, so they would say, no, actually, I thought the most important thing was, you know, I don't think that was the most important thing. The most important thing was that, you know, and it's very good to get that peer support and peer reviewing amongst your colleagues, because you all learn from that. And quite often you know, I mean, loads of times you get loads of issues that I wouldn't have thought of, or, you know, it's not necessarily you know, the senior member of staff knows best, because often the other researchers are much more embedded in the literature and stuff as well at the moment. So, you know, how am I doing for time? Sorry.
It's about 1:30, is it?
Oh, okay.
25 to.
Okay. When do I have to stop?
They've got lunch.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Right. Okay. 12. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
It made me wonder whether you could do both, whether you could write the original paper that was just presenting some data, work, and then like the sort of the deeper paper that you mentioned. Because sometimes you see when you're looking at literature yourself, you see some people it looks like they publish the same thing a few times.
Yeah.
So can you talk a bit about when that's okay?
Yeah.
When it's not okay?
Yeah. What you don't want is salami slicing, so where you're just slicing a project up into loads of slightly, the same data but slightly, or material slightly topped and tailed with a different, but I think this partly comes to a sort of point number 9 really, that you need to be aware of the hierarchy of your own papers on your CV, in that sometimes it is good to get an early 2-star paper out as a position, new data, it's within your contract, there are practical reasons to do it, and then a little while on you may have had time to do more deeper thinking on it, or you have reframed it, and then you'll do a bigger kind of more think piece which includes those sorts of findings as well. But so for a CV, that's fine. You have a hierarchy of your own work. Sometimes you get invited to write a paper after a conference or something, and you think, oh, it's not my best one, and it's a bit tangential, and but it's still quite good to have it on the CV, and I can do it in 2 weeks because I've done most of the work, and that's fine. But you've always got to have in your mind, what are my top papers? And so in that case, that one with the thinking around it plus the data would be a referable paper probably that you would want to put forward, and one of the ones you'd be sort of prouder of. But sometimes it's just pragmatically okay to get those earlier, quicker papers out as well. But sometimes if doing that early one is going to stop you doing the bigger one, then don't do it. If there's no opportunity cost really of doing the quicker one, that's sort of okay. But don't do it instead of the bigger one. Hang on a bit and get the big thinking. It's all right to use the same data and the same material, but you don't. The papers have to be significantly different in their viewpoint. You probably in the ref, for example, you wouldn't put both of those papers in. You wouldn't want that. That would be overlap. So, yeah.
An example of how that works in science.
Yeah.
Where sometimes if you're developing a new approach to doing something, a new methodology, it's quite important sometimes to have a sort of a methods development paper published as a foundation stone to then be able to talk about how that then impacts how you might do something else. So sometimes you've got to get the foundation stone before you can do the bigger paper, because if you try and do the bigger paper and include the method development in it, it comes back from the reviewer saying, well, there's not enough of how this method came about, and you're trying to do too much in one paper. So sometimes you need that platform.
And then you really have to look at which journals take methodology papers, don't you? And, because sometimes again, that's being aware of the hierarchy of your own publications on your CV, that, in most fields, certain journals take methodology and methodological development papers and others don't. So it's fine to have those, it's quite good to have those, but not at the expense of the big, you don't want to get to the ref and have 4 methodology papers necessarily. Any other issues, comments about that? Okay. So I'll take sort of 6 to 8 then. This was one of the things that frustrated me most, I think, doing our ref return that we had, was that people hadn't got the biggest, most significant and wide-ranging message possible from the material that they were presenting. And there's a thing, I think this is about, instead of just reporting a study, take the time to step back from it and put it in a wider context. And you can be speculative, about the impacts of how your research might, at the end of the paper, how it might affect practice or policy or whatever in your field. But most research is quite incremental, actually. To get the funding, it's quite incremental. You don't have a lot of amazing blue sky stuff. So if if you're presenting incremental research and maybe a survey results or qualitative research or some design outputs or something, for it to elevate ever above a 2-star, you've got to have the bigger picture, you've got to have that bigger context. And remember that for ref, everybody's always looking at significance and reach of everything. So is it significant, and does it have a wide reach? And if you can explain that, again, I keep going back to this. So, and you can have, it can be significant and have reach in different ways. You know, so it could be that you challenge a particular conceptual framework or model in your field, or you contradict a prevailing theory or discourse, or you know, or you're advancing a theory, or you know, always look bigger than, you know, here's my study of. I'll use examples from our own research so don't offend anybody. You know, here's our study of walking patterns in 4 developments in Oxfordshire. You know, I mean, you can just present that, but where does it sit in bigger debates? And again, that's kind of, it goes back to thinking of it as a mini project and having a life. You know, this paper will still be read in 10, 15 years' time, you hope. So what's the bigger claim? So don't just blankly present new data and facts and expect it to be a 4-star or a 3-star paper. That is not. Because when, you know, everything that gets published is okay. You know, everything that gets published, you know, on the ref panel, everything we see has been through the refereeing process. So nothing's going to be you'd hope, nothing's going to be absolutely dreadful. So everything's already at a certain standard. So what is it that lifts it from, you know, a 1 to a 2, a 2 to a 3, and a 3 to a 4? And it's these kind of techniques, I think, in positioning. The 7th point was to be bold with your academic voice. And I think this is really, really critical, and something that I sort of really encourage people to do, which is, so it's a different point to 6. 6 is about the significance and setting it in a context. 7 is explicitly thinking about what is new with your paper, and you know, have you conceptualised it in a new way? Is it you know, the largest study of its type? This is what needs to go in the abstract as well. But part of this is, I think, if you've done enough research to write a paper on something, you have got views on it, and you know, so often those views aren't in the paper because of a lack of sort of confidence, or a thinking that there's a particular way to do academic writing, which is that you know, or I'm too junior to have opinions on, you know, who am I to say, you know, to question a particular, you know, dominant way of thinking or whatever. But if you've done research on it, particularly if you've done a doctorate in it, you really do have, you know, you can have an authoritative, grounded, fact-based, research-based, evidence-based view and state it authoritatively. And that makes for a good paper and a good writing style. It's not something I ever struggled with. I was like that when I was very young, I think. But it surprises me when other people have got really important things to say and they're not stating. You know that we see this a lot, don't we? People who've done really, really good research but don't boldly state it in a paper, and you think, be more confident with it. Come on. So you don't overstate, because that looks a bit silly, and you can sniff that out a mile off. But you make justifiable claims. So this is what I'm saying. Don't research things. Don't present things in a sort of micro context. And referees will always come back to you and tell you that you've overclaimed, but they very rarely come back and say, "Oh, you should big up your research," you know, something. And really be careful about I mean, again, going through the papers for our submission, people were describing their work in the abstracts as incremental, small scale, sort of playing down the work. If you go to the ref guidance, the word incremental is the very definition of a 2-star paper. So you might as well be writing, "Here's my 2-star paper." You know, just don't do it. Let the reader decide if it's small scale and incremental, but don't. And again, it's not about being dishonest. It's about presenting your research in a good light. If you think it's that small and don't publish it, wait till you've got something better to say. But don't. We're very modest, I think, and so don't overstate, but be bold about it, and really do try to sort of develop your academic voice. And that comes on to 8 as well, which is about developing a clear and engaging writing style. And again, I think sometimes, to be quite honest, I nearly died of boredom, or at least had severe trouble staying awake, or, and it's not to do with the topic of the research. No, it's not to do with, almost any topic can be interesting if it's well written. And almost any topic can just send you to sleep if it, And sometimes I just felt like going back to people and saying, and you get this with papers on, did you really enjoy writing that? Because did you ever think what it would be like for anybody else other than you to read this? Because, clearly you wrote it in a cupboard, with and I just think, again, the papers we go back to in our own. I remember papers that I read when I was doing my PhD that I still can visualise the layout now, and I can still remember the arguments, and they were authors that I liked, and I can remember thinking, God, I would love, that's the sort of writer I want to be. That's the sort of, I don't really want to be that, although it's really good, I don't want to be that, but I want to be that sort of writer. And I think to have a clear idea about that from the start is really good. And I think you need to picture yourself as the reader, picking up the paper, no background knowledge. Is your style engaging? Which papers do you like? Which ones do you go back to? Emulate the styles that you like. And as I say, academic careers get built on different types of writing. And academics get asked to do jobs because of the way they write. So if you want, in our field, for example, if you're known in your academic papers being quite accessible but very good in terms of content, but very clear you're more likely to get a phone call from government offices going, can you do this review or not? Compared to some absolutely brilliant work that is really dense and really difficult and really, and those guys have, that's quality work. Particularly in ARFA, there's a lot of work around modelling and the science of cities, but it's not kind of accessible, and they don't, that you look at the material and you think actually that could be written in a much easier to understand way, but there's a kind of culture around that type of work, but they're not the people that get involved in policy development or impact work necessarily. They stay in a particular set of journals, and all of that is fine, but you don't find many people that do both, So I think develop the sort of writer you want to be and be conscious of that style early on. And I think, and then once you get, once you get good at it, if you're good at critiques, if you're good at presenting new data, then that's how you get to developing 3- and 4-star papers, really, whichever style you go for. But I think clarity and a clear and engaging writing style is really important. Juliet, your papers are great. Hundreds and hundreds, and I remember your papers. I could, and I think that, that they were very original, very clear. Start at the beginning, take you through. Some really, really. You should distribute them for some good examples. But
I'm embarrassed.
That's all right.
It's off the camera.
But if you don't find your, this is what I think. If you don't find your paper interesting, how can you expect anybody else to? So I'll stop there. Any sort of thinking?
Like a French social theorist, I think, is the next one.
Yeah, French social theorists are very. Some people love it though, don't they? The people who sit in French cafes, the sociologists who sit in cafes in France reading Deleuze or Lefebvre. Yeah. But does that kind of resonate with people? Does it kind of... Do you find it difficult to... Do you find it difficult to kind of put your own opinions into papers? Do you find that...
Yes, getting the balance between having an authoritative academic voice and talking in the way one would want to be spoken to.
Yeah.
That can be quite hard. Sometimes the pressure is to put in all those polysyllabic words and convoluted sentence structures just to sound so that you know what you're saying.
Yeah.
You just want to say, here it is.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's really tricky because you're trying to sort of fit in a culture of your own subject. But I still think in most subjects the best people, write clearly at least, I mean, in architectural theory they've had a few hoax papers that have got accepted, over the last 10 years where people have just jargon generated and sent them in and they've been accepted. So it shows. But what's the point, what's the point of only 10 people understanding I mean...
Is there an issue though with the type of thing that you're writing about? So, going back to your comments, the type of papers that I was writing, especially around sort of everyday life or how you use your time on the train, is a very accessible topic to anybody from any discipline. Therefore, in a way, it's easier to write something that's quite interesting and engaging for other people. Whereas if you're trying to write something about a transport model, the subject matter is much harder to sell in that broader way. And whether you had any thoughts on that?
It is, but I still think the beginning and ends of papers should be understandable to a general audience. I mean, clearly when you're, the chunk of material often in the middle is incredibly specific and specialised, and you would expect it to be, could be on environmental impact modelling or whatever. But even still, you should be able to explain why this is important, in a general way. What is, why do you need... I mean, you say that about the work that you do, but other people could write about, travel time use, for example, in a very different way. I mean, obviously sociological papers tend to be quite, you would expect them to be quite readable, and they're not. I mean, some of them, you get to the end of the paper and you think, actually, you were talking about binge drinking on a Friday night and patterns of binge drinking in Britain and where it happens, and the conclusions are it happens in shopping centres and, whatever. And you've had this massive, unnecessary sociological kind of structure, with the structuration and you obviously need a bit of that, but you still should have an abstract and a start and a finish that somebody outside that field or somebody, an informed and intelligent reader could understand why it's significant, at least, how you've positioned the research and why it's significant. I don't mind some jargon. I mean, that's kind of, but I think there's a kind of jargon, hump mid-career. I think people feel that they need it to get on, and they do a lot of it, and then once they've sort of got really established in their career, they get the freedom to be simpler again. It's a bit like art, I think. You start really, and then when you're really successful, you can be more naive again in a way. And often those people who are kind of confident enough to not need all of that as a crutch write the better papers. But
reference thing, because it's sort of resonated with me, that thing about jargon, but also referencing. Sometimes you read a paper and every 2 words there's a bracket with a name and a date sort of thing.
Yeah.
Just that kind of that crutch, I guess, just proves that you read a lot by referencing the hell out of the thing.
Yeah.
Kind of appropriate, and how reviewers kind of see through that or not, or what they kind of prefer. Really.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way to tackle that is, again, and you see this a lot in doctoral work, is to work harder to summarise the arguments rather than to just almost in note form say they said this, they said in a, you know, you get those great long paragraphs where it's found blah blah blah, found blah blah blah, found. What you really want is a harder worked paragraph which says there are several bodies of knowledge on this. A group of authors have argued or found X, and you know, found a relationship between blah 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 blah, and then the references don't disturb the text and are all at the end of the sentence. And then there's a second group of, you know, blah 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 blah, and then a second set of reference. That's a harder work way of doing it rather than just note taking and, you know, condensing a big lit review. But that is better writing, and it doesn't, you know, I mean, clearly in some fields you've got to name and summarise the key writers or the key, you know, thinkers in that field. But I tend to prefer that. Again, it's you taking control of the narrative and control of the argument, and it's how, what's important is how you've synthesised that material. So that's why you need it that way round, because then you keep your voice. You don't get, that keeps the argument and your voice dominant in your paper, rather than the voice of 6 people who've said X and Y. But it takes longer, and it's a more rigorous process.
There's a really good blog that I love. Pat Thompson, Professor Pat Thompson, Professor of Education at Nottingham University. She came in the summer to do a workshop with doctoral students about developing their academic voice and academic writing. Then in the afternoon she did the same workshop but from a supervisor's point of view. And her blog, if you have a look for it, it's just called Patter. It's a WordPress blog. She talks about the difference between a kind of a bullet list literature review and something that's about your voice. And there's loads of really great advice on there, including a link to a phrase bank, which I think is really useful, of kind of, you know, those signposting phrases that you need to take the reader on that next part of the journey.
Notwithstanding.
Yes. Just some comments. First of all, I think I would venture to suggest that we'll label this session world leading, with not sparing Katie any blushes. And so I think there's an element probably where we're not overwhelmed, but there's such a richness of it becomes common sense. But I think you've captured such a richness. It doesn't particularly provoke controversy and people saying, "Hang on, you know." But coming back to the ref, one of the challenges we realised was that, particularly, you may have come across these impact case studies, which can only be 4 pages long. When you read the finished product, it can appear beautifully simple, and it disguises the fact that there was blood, sweat and tears to get there. And I think trying to see all of this in the round, one way to the issue of self-discipline. So, you know, I can remember years ago going on the time management, which is the classic thing where you immerse yourself in a bubble for a day, talking about time management. You think, oh, of course, it's all so obvious, yeah, I might. And you go back into the real world of your office the next day, and it all gets blown apart and lost. And so, even if all this is very good sense, of course, some of it you need to experiment with to find your place. But in the end, this requires a huge amount of self-discipline, because it isn't there's not a quick fix to writing a 3 or 4 star paper. There's probably a few individuals who are lucky enough to have sort of hardwired all that excellent thinking Katie's shared with us into their first drafting of what they write. So self-discipline, but also the points made earlier that it's really a journey. And although if you take all this advice on board, the first version or the version you submit to a journal will be a lot further forward in its assessment. In some ways, you really do have to view that when you press the submit button, that's the start of the journey, not almost reaching the end. And I suppose, I think someone's mentioned it already, and Katie said at the start, you have to treat it as a labour of love, because it does require so much self-discipline, because it is painful, because you will get knockbacks, because there'll be the day job getting in the way and the next project. It's only if you really want to make this work and have a self-belief that a year later, 5 years later, you'll be really proud of this, and it becomes a defining feature of your career, that you'll have the energy and commitment to do it. So I mean, I don't know quite how you can't just give that advice and easily take it, but I'm well aware the stage I'm at, that all these issues, when you actually sit down, I mean, what I've said to people is, when you're writing a paper, is your main goal just to get the email from the editor that says, I've accepted your paper? Because unless it's in Nature, where, as we've heard earlier, you'd be damn lucky to get it accepted if it wasn't 4-star. But in a lot of journals, just because you've got it accepted doesn't make it the paper you're going to be proud of, doesn't mean it's not been salami sliced and so on. But it's actually so easy to be in that mindset of, my God, I've got so much else going on. Once I get yes from the editor, that's enough. But to have the confidence and resolution to say, no, I'm not there yet. And I suppose what I've come to realise is if you can create the opportunity for a stepwise approach, so that if you've got a conference that you can prepare the first version of the paper for without kind of losing it to being published, but then you take some breathing space and come back to it perhaps 3 or 4 months later with a fresh pair of eyes, not just the conclusion but the whole thing. And this idea we heard earlier from Katie of perhaps then completely reworking that paper, but allowing yourself to rework it, not think I'm too busy, I've just got to tweak a bit and get it in. I think you can help make it easier, but you can't allow impatience to come in then, because this is really a journey that can take a long time, but will be worth it. And I think we've heard points made earlier about, well, how will this affect me when I'm, never mind the ref, when I'm applying for jobs or for regrading. And I think there is going back a few years, it's perhaps quite hard for someone on a panel. They look at your CV, well, they don't know all the journals, they've certainly not read your papers. It looks quite impressive if you've got volume. And so that has been enough, 2 stars been okay. But what I'm seeing more and more now is that the sort of sharp people, if you like, who are promoting themselves are saying, well, I've got a Google Scholar profile, my H-index, the attractiveness of my work to others, and indeed perhaps here are my 4 best papers in my CV that have been cited this many times. So, quality really is going to matter, and I think this is something that's changing quite rapidly. So have confidence that, yes, you're going to. This does mean this labour of love that you simply can't produce as many papers. So let go of some of the ones that, as Katie's mentioned, just were really, they were incremental, they were 2-star, they didn't excite you, you're not going to read them again, they're just a notch on the bedpost, I think. So yeah, I don't know, that was just my set of reactions.
It's really hard. I mean, I don't think, it's really hard because papers never have a deadline like everything else you're doing does, so it's always the thing that, stays on the to-do list, but not always, but it's the thing that, but it really is important to do. Actually, confessionally, I don't think I've written a paper since I've been at UWE which hasn't been invited with a deadline. So I haven't found the time to, for fun, sit back and write a paper in 7 years. So every paper I've done has been, I've got an EPSRC project with a special edition coming out, and everyone funded under that programme has been invited to put a paper in, or I've gone to a conference and it's been invited for a special edition, or, obviously my research team are putting, but in terms of my lead authorship, and luckily I'm at a sort of stage now where that's, it's easy because you're already invited, so, there's still the same refereeing process, but there's more of a hands-on editorial process because they want a good collection of papers, But it is really hard to find the time to. But you have to make the time. It's critically important, particularly as you're developing your career, sort of your profile. Some of my favourite papers that I wrote now is still literally the first paper I wrote after my PhD is still one of my favourite papers that I think is one of the most rounded ones that I did, because I had 3 years worth of thinking on a page, and then others are sort of, where I'm summarising the key findings from 12 people's research on a 3-year project we've had funded. Of course they're big and they should be 4-star, they should be they should be in the best journals, and but then you have other ones along the way that are kind of not your bigger ones. But as sort of an aside, but the title of your papers is really, really important as well. Really important, because when everyone's doing literature reviews, you know, if you find, so early on in my career, my thing was, or still is really, but sustainable urban form. So what shape and size and density and everything should cities be to be sustainable? And, you know, you're doing a literature review on that. I'm doing one now for a review for government. And, you know, you're searching away quickly and, you know, you'll get a paper again, and the title will be the impact of density on walking levels in San Francisco and blah, 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 a cross-sectional study. Okay. And then you'll get another one and it'll be state-of-the-art pros and cons of intensification policy. And you're like, I've got to read that paper, right? That I can't, you know, if I'm going to read 20, that's one of the, and you go to it and hopefully it will be about that. Sometimes a bit sneaky and they've put, you know, something rubbish like a little tiny micro study in with a big title. That's not great. But wherever possible, really do, I don't like these gimmicky titles for academic papers, but don't, again, the paper doesn't have to be the same title as the project. And lots of people do just put the project title up, and it can be, you know, you want your papers to be must-reads, not optionals, when someone's in that field, you know. But we've all done that. I published a book that I cannot remember the title of. I've never been able to say the title of, and it was because the publishers told me that I needed all of these phrases in to hit the search engines. So it's something like transport mobility, sustainable urban form, or some sustainable mobility, and something like, there's 3 phrases. And even at the launch I was worried that I wouldn't be able to, I had to have it written down. I was like, that's a lesson. Don't let the publishers tell you what to do, you know, because it didn't do very well. I don't think it was very widely cited, even with that title. So, but that was kind of a book from a conference, you know. So anyway, you live and learn with these things. So, 2 points really, just to finish off then. So this is the point about which we keep reiterating about quality and quantity. So this is the point about that your CV will have a hierarchy of quality of papers and sort of accept which ones are which and which are your big hitters and which are your, you know. But also you want, this is not really about 4-star papers, this is about your collection of publications. I think what you want to have, when you look down the titles and the journals, you kind of have a hit list of what journals do you want to publish in, you know, and in the titles of your papers you want to see a sort of a progression, a development of an argument. And you know, you can always frame your research from quite different perspectives. So do think about how the titles of your papers work for you on your CV when you look down the list, you know. I think in our area, you know, you could, like some of our papers could be called something like, you know, housing policy, equally though, you know, growth policy or something, or housing growth policy. But you want, you know, if you have a few papers on growth and then suddenly you're calling it housing, it looks, you know, different. So just be aware that when you want a nice consistent looking CV, not repetitive, but a kind of, you want to show a progression in your work as you look down. You want to see a nice list of top journals as you work the way through the years. Be confident in your work, as I say, get it right and aim high. I actually find it a really democratic process. What you were asking about, Joe, that I've always found with research bidding, funds, and with publication, that people judge what's in front of them. And again, I think there's a kind of mythology around you have to be a professor to be a PI and all this sort of thing. It's not been my experience, it's not the current experience in our research centre. We've got, you know, research fellows PIing, actually winning Research Council grants when they were an RA, leading. You know, you judge what's in front of you, and you do quickly look through the CVs and the track record, but you'll be swayed mainly by the quality of the work in front of you. So yeah, aim high. Make sure it's the best one you can do. Look at current volumes, recent volumes of that journal to just see if your paper fits, if you get a feel for it fitting in. Sometimes journals say on their guidance for authors, you know, we take methodology, we take this, and you look at the last year and you think, well, they haven't had one, so do they really mean it, or have they just not been getting them? And sometimes an email to the editor before you start is better. I tend to work for a journal, so I select the journal and then write for that journal. I don't kind of write and then, you know, think, oh, where shall I put it? So I tend to choose the journal up front, and most of our team do that really. Again, follow the author's guidance to the letter. Don't annoy people. Be professional in all of that kind of side of it early on. It's really important. If they ask for the illustrations in a JPEG, give them in a JPEG. Don't read, proofread. Don't send anything off with a typo in it. This has got 5 typos in it. I checked it last night and kicked myself because I wrote it quickly yesterday. So I'm telling you now, I know there are 5 typos in this. But don't ever send anything else with typos in. It just makes you look sloppy. And get friendly views. Set up a writing group, even if it's informal. Get other people to read your work. If you don't have a deadline, use peer review and critical friends, as they were called in the ref. Critical friends is great, and you learn a lot both about your own work and about other people's work by doing that. And accept any opportunities to review papers. Many of you probably already doing this for journals anyway. Ask your line manager to, if they get requests to referee papers. If I get asked to referee a paper, I can either say no, or I can say no, but someone in my team can do it. So you want your line managers to do that option, because then you get the experience as well, and it's really useful experience seeing what other people are submitting to journals. Partly because a lot of it's really rubbish, and it makes you feel good. You think, well, other people are putting that in, and also you see what other referee, because then you referee, and then other people. And journals often are just happy for someone to referee. They're not going to look for your CV and that. If I recommend someone in my team, usually the journal will say, fine, that's okay. And then you get to see how other people referee papers as well, because you get to see the other reviewers' comments, and that's really useful, because then when you're writing your papers, you think, oh yeah, that might be the sort of thing I'm going to get back, So yeah, avoid substantive overlap in your papers. You don't want your papers all to be about the same thing, and have a ref outputs plan as early as possible. I think so. You've got a sort of CV papers publication plan, and then within your team, often it's good to at least discuss a ref plan quite early on. Seems a long way off now, but it'll come around quickly whether you're here or whether you've moved on. And then the final point really was just to sort of enjoy academic writing, which again, sort of where I started, that it is a creative process. It should be enjoyable. When I think of the work that, when I look back and think of the work that I've done, some of my best weeks of when I've sort of shut myself away and written a paper and been really happy with it at the end, or a book chapter or something, I don't really look back fondly on management meetings and spreadsheets and things like that, but it's really satisfying. There's still nothing, you still get a little dopamine thing when you get your paper published and arrives in your pigeonhole or online, and you can access your paper now, and you see it, desktop published, and you still get a little kind of, I think when I stop getting that, I'll stop writing really. But there is something incredibly satisfying that all of that messy process of a research has been consolidated in a paper and improved and published, And I think what you're always aiming for in 4-star papers, what I like about 4-star papers is that they are both authoritative but still inquiring. So that's the sort of real sign of academic maturity, that it's really got an authoritative critique, an authoritative presentation, but there's a kind of humility about what we don't know as well, how far, what else there is still, you know, so where your research sits in the knowledge development in your field, or where it sits in a kind of international context or whatever. So I think that, to me, when I get to the end of a paper and think, yeah, that's usually that's what it's got. I think that combination of authoritative, clear, well explained, enjoyable to read, but also still there's a humility about the kind of position that it takes, you know. I don't like these papers that tell you they've solved the problems of the world, and you know. So I think that's what you're kind of, and again, that's a kind of academic maturity thing, that it's fine to say we don't know this and we don't know that, and this is still to be done. Yeah. So, yeah, any comments or questions about that bit? Yeah.
About books and book chapters.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, I got kind of jaded with journals. You know, the whole, it's behind a firewall, very limited readership, and I thought, let's go
Yeah.
book chapters instead, and got
Yeah.
through those. But, you know, what takes precedence, I guess, and the 4-star and the sort of tone of it and stuff like that, really.
There's no doubt really that in the referee journal articles are still top dog, and the strategy we run really is that get your papers sorted and then you can do other things, you know, or at least get your plan for your papers sorted. I think book chapters are important. They're important for different things, same as books, you know. So often your books, if you edit or author a book, or if you do book chapters in a edited volume that is really state of the art in your field, in that area at that time, that helps you kind of be in that community and be seen in that community as a key academic working in this field at this moment. But they don't tend to be as well cited usually as referee journal articles because they're harder to find. And often they don't last. Ironically, really, the shelf life of books can often be shorter than journal papers, which still get cited sort of a long time after. So my view is I write book chapters when friendly people that I think do good work ask me to, and I've edited, and editing books early in my career was really fantastic for me. It was the thing that sort of launched my career really, rather than papers. But then, you know, me and 2 other colleagues took the lead on editing, ran conferences as well, and those, you know, it's ridiculous. The books are still in print now, and it's like 20 years ago or something. So I think they really have a value, again, on a CV sort of hierarchy. But I would never say put your time and energy into book chapters ahead of papers. I'd do those sort of first and have a plan for those first, and then strategically think, you know, there's always an opportunity cost. Whatever you say yes to, that means you're not doing something else, you know, time lost on something else. So always be careful about that trade-off. Yeah.
Something else I just wanted to add in, again, just reflecting what you were saying, Katie, is aim high but in the right direction. And by that I mean that if you want a 3-star or 4-star paper, then don't run scared from the journals you know produce those 3 and 4-star papers, but don't confuse rejection from a journal because of quality with rejection because of poor fit. And I think sometimes it's not clear which of those you're facing. But certainly aim high, but be prepared for the worst case scenario being outright rejection, but still thinking, well, it doesn't mean the world's rejected me, it probably means maybe this can't be 4 or 3-star, and I can, if I at least want to convert it to get something from it, I put it into a lesser journal. Or it means by aiming high, I've had such high quality feedback, although I'm not sure how strong a correlation there is between the calibre of the journal and necessarily the reviewers always, that in some of the reviews are the same across what might be quite an array of impact factors of journals. But chances are if you submit to a high impact factor journal, you'll get high quality critique, which will be a bitter pill to swallow, but it is telling you how to produce a 3-star version of your paper if you've got the appetite and the passion to go through the next iteration of it.
Yeah, and it never ends. I mean, I think this is why I feel this kind of, we get the same rubbish comments back on papers, and every paper you put in, you're going to get 3 completely different takes on it, 4 or 5, that you do go and cry in a corner, partly because you disagree with them, partly because you can see they're right and you're going to have to do something about it, and partly because some of them are unreasonable, and you think, well, but then when you actually stop, you go, well, maybe that's because I didn't explain the starting point or the limitations or where I was drawing the boundaries around my research, or, but it's not kind of like, oh, you don't know anything and we're expert. We know. It's exactly. We're all in the same process. Our point in our careers. One day I'm sitting on a EPSRC panel, deciding and interviewing people for grants, and then 2 weeks later, I'm the other side of the desk, presenting with all the critiques around my research. This is academic life. It never gets. You never just get, it's just a continuum, isn't it? And almost the further on you get, the harsher the criticism gets in some way, because people, because you're aiming bigger pots of money, and you have to develop a really thick skin. You have to know your strengths. You have to know when to say to a reviewer, I'm not making those changes because that referee's misunderstood the point. If you respond to every point that every referee makes, you'd end up with a Frankenstein paper, So you can't possibly do that most of the time. So but all of that is a kind of, you have to do it politely, you have to do it professionally, however you might be feeling, you just have to, and it never ends. I mean, I think it's why it's quite exhausting, really, isn't it?
Just back to Joe's earlier point about, I can't remember how you framed it, but this idea of, but I'm only at this stage of my career, dare I go?
Yeah.
But in fact, I think Katie's absolutely right. If you do, whether it's on a panel or whether you're a peer reviewer, they set out the rules for you, the code of conduct. And actually, that it's the easiest thing to do is to be completely objective and apply that approach. And so I think most people do that. Inevitably, there are some rogues in the system, but actually the rogues are just as likely to pick on the professor and say, you need to come down a peg or 2, and find it refreshing that there's an unthreatening young researcher who's put in a great idea. So, the tables could turn to your advantage, but fundamentally it's believing that the system, it's an imperfect system, but it's broadly fair, I would say. And so, the one caveat though is remembering that it's a human being judging whether it's your paper or your proposal. And I think sometimes we'd have this idea that if we sort of followed the mechanics of it, there's a black box we feed it into, and a machine kind of grades it and comes back. And we're shocked then when somebody didn't like our paper, and it's because, as Katie said, you wrote it in a cupboard and you hated it yourself, and just thought, the black box would accept it. So yeah, having confidence is important, rather than being put off by the message that it doesn't necessarily get tremendously easier as you go through your career. It's more that you get a thicker skin and you've got the scars to prove it, but a belief that if you persevere, you'll make it.
I know this isn't remotely boasting, but I haven't had a paper rejected ever, and I think it's because I'm really clear in my writing, and I think that's why I emphasise this thing about the emotional response to a paper, because if they've understood what you were trying to say and where you were coming from, and they'll come back and say, yeah, but that argument wasn't strong. I mean, I've had loads of criticism, but I haven't had a rejection, because they can come and tell you what to do to improve your paper. Often when you get actually rejected, it's because someone is so frustrated because they haven't got a blooming clue what you were trying to say, and it might actually be pretty good research, but it's presented in such a convoluted way, or it's just dumped on the paper with no argument or structure, that you've lost patience with it. So you go, no, just not having it, So I think if you all, as long as you take the trouble to explain your work, and you can, though, it's like with supervisions for PhDs, they're easy to do because you can go straight to the material and say, you know, you need to change that or emphasise that, or that doesn't seem to quite line up. But you haven't just lost patience with it, and it's kind of, I think that's one of the key things. Same with bids. I mean, I sat on a panel a few weeks ago in Sweden, and we had to review 48 bids, and every one was 68 pages long, and quite a lot of them, by page 12, I didn't know what they were trying to do. And, there were no, and like, there were so many subject headings and so many, and you've got to put yourself in the position of that reviewer, and if you don't state your aims and your objectives and the position of your research right up front in bold, nicely presented, logical structure, if you just start with a great diatribe about, I won't give examples because I'm on film, but the context of this in this particular country, and blah, 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 and you're on page 3 before there's any intent of what they're going to do, and you've lost your reader, and a lot of papers are like that.
I wonder if we're almost out of time, but I wonder if to wrap up, I'm quite keen just to get a sort of barometer reading, really, about how some of you are feeling, whether you're sort of going away inspired, thinking, actually, yes, we're at the start of a new ref period, I'm up for this, or whether you're thinking, blimey, it's even more daunting than I thought. I think I'll stick with 2-star, or maybe I'm not going to be an academic after all. I mean, what's the sense that you have from the session?
It's been really inspirational, actually. I think going into this, I really questioned whether or not it was possible, but now I think it is.
Of course it is, Jo. You work really hard.
I think it is probably the most inspirational talk I've ever heard on the Researchers Forum. So thank you so much for that. But at the same time, it's not for you.
Yeah.
Comparing what you've written here in such a motivational way, and it really inspires anybody. If you compare this to the reality of, well, I'm talking for myself, for my situation, for instance, I get really discouraged because I can just see how it can be difficult, not because I can't do it, but because I don't have control on something, and something just out of my control, especially if you work part-time or if you work in a project that doesn't lend itself to 4-star or even 2-star academic publications, and you end up doing a lot of project management, reporting, attending meetings that are all really useful and essential to deliver and to produce the deliverable that the client has paid you for. So you're doing the best for that, but then all the academic outputs are left in the air. And so it is extremely hard to do both. And some people do that in their own spare time if they can. Some people can't do that in their spare time, and so they get, like me, they get discouraged and frustrated, but they don't lose their confidence.
That's why I keep saying to Glenn, we need sabbaticals. Time.
Not to try and completely turn that sort of concern into a positive, but I think, again, like many of these training sessions, we put ourselves in a bubble in terms of just thinking about writing. And I think, unfortunately, there are some opportunities that come up probably quite rarely after someone's PhD, where you actually have proper breathing space to just, as Katie said, those treats where you lock yourself away for a week. But I think don't be sort of misread into thinking that most people are in a very nicely sort of organised system where they have, now's my time to do this rather than that. There are some tough realities, and we're always working, of course, to try and see how we can make that better. And yes, as Katie's picked up, one of the things we have put in our faculty in terms of how we deal with research with impact is raising the question, at least, of what do we mean by sabbatical, or even do we have sabbaticals in this university, and how can we bring them about in a way that helps overcome some of these difficulties?
Yeah, it was a real frustration because I completely, I feel the same, Miriam. I finished one project and the pressure's on to get the next, and that's a big job to write the next big bid, and and I haven't written, my last 2 EPSRC projects, I've written invited papers with deadlines to complete the project. Other than that, nothing.
Since I joined uni in 2009,
Yeah.
I haven't written all the papers that have gone in the ref
Yeah.
from me. I've written either all of them or bits of them in my previous life.
Yeah.
In another university, and I'm not making comparisons between
Yeah,
universities.
yeah.
I think it's just a matter of which project.
European work, yeah, it's difficult.
And the kind of leadership and vision and
Yeah.
all these things together. So since 2009, I haven't been able to do this, and
Yeah.
I really enjoy that.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I feel like
You get anxious then because you're like, where's it going to come from?
I've produced. It's not that I feel I haven't done anything. I've
Yeah.
produced, but the only thing is, I'm not going to be assessed on the basis of
Yeah.
all the other good things I've done,
Yeah.
delivered, and I've given the client what they wanted.
Yeah.
All this for the university and for my academic career,
Mm.
I'm not going to evaluate it on
Yeah.
the basis of that, but on the basis of the papers. And if I don't produce papers, then that's it.
Just to move to this, we've heard from that table. Any other, just while waiting for food as well, incidentally, Paul's disappeared to ensure that happens. Any other sort of reflections really on the session before we close for lunch?
Yeah, I was very inspired as well, and in a way it made it, you explain in practical terms what is the next step to produce a good quality paper, and although there's lots of work involved, it seems possible because it's clear. So what, I don't want to go into too much detail about my own situation, but what I fear is it's like the lack of mentorship, basically. So I, to sort of bounce back ideas and see what I'm writing is good enough, basically, to go beyond what I've done so far. So that's in terms of the structure of where I am.
I think we ought to start up again. I mean, our reading group sort of stopped because everyone felt they'd got what they needed out of it. I think probably if we set up, we've got different staff. I think the ref and the feedback process to ref kind of alerted people to where there were issues with their work or whether they could improve and stuff. And I think starting up that, because then you get peer review and then a senior academic coming to each one. I mean, we used to do it once a fortnight and go for lunch, and we'd all look at one paper, and so it's a rotating group of people, and whoever could make it. But at least I went every week, every fortnight, and 5 or 6 other people, and that's probably the best way of doing it, because people have papers all the time and drafts and things, didn't they? And we could comment on referees' comments, for example, between us, and people could vent their spleen and whatever. So I think that's probably, one-to-one is great, but also I think that kind of system is good. Because if you get one person, you only get one view on it. If you have a mentor, you only get one view. It's kind of
This idea you had about the away day where we read papers and we assess them, and I thought, oh God, I wish I'd been there.
It was really nice.
I think notwithstanding the tightening of resource, if you like, that's just applying quite widely. It's trying to keep an eye out, and it's as much for centre directors and managers as it is for staff, but for false economies. And I can remember when I came here, I'd come from a situation at my last university where it had got to the point of headless chicken mode, where there was lots of apparent success, projects coming in and things happening, but we never had monthly meetings. We never took the team away and reflected. And when you try and introduce that, it feels like a luxury, and you think, can we afford that? Can we afford to do this? But actually, over the time period, the sorts of things Katie does with her centre pay a huge dividend back in, because if you only ever run around like a headless chicken at 2-star level, eventually that will catch up with you, and you'll be seen for what that represents. When it's holding your nerve, investing time in the right way, rather than the short-term pressures sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was sort of one half a day at a strategy event or something. And it was a bit of an experiment for me, because I didn't know if we would all agree, and so part of it was for me as a manager to see if we did all know what So if the results had been very different and everybody thought it was something else, then we would have had to develop another strategy of right, so now we need to sort of dissect that and see what people are thinking, and but the fact that everybody agreed, it kind of demystified everything. So then when we're writing our papers and planning things, we can't all say, I don't know what a 2-star paper, because we've kind of demystified it. So it kind of gets that out of it. And even on the ref panel, we have that exercise where we demystify and we calibrate, so we all know when we're all talking about, a 2-star or a 3-star, there's across all the panels, they have that calibration exercise so that it's demystified, so you don't just go off by yourself and, give things a force. And it is amazingly, after you've looked at 20 papers,
Okay, well, time has run away with us, but I think just to echo what Miriam said, I'm sure I'm sort of speaking for everyone and saying a huge thank you to Katie, but also Nico together earlier for a really excellent session.
Thank you.